Good afternoon and welcome to our audience here, and as Mr. Larson said, on C-SPAN to the 2022 James Madison Lecture. A lecture with the provocative title, "Was James Madison Truly the Father of the Constitution?" Our lecturer is Akhil Reed Amar, the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University, where he teaches constitutional law both in Yale College and Yale Law School. After graduating from Yale College, summa cum laude, and from Yale Law School, and clerking for then Judge, now Supreme Court Justice, Stephen Breyer, Amar joined the Yale faculty in 1985 at the tender age of 26. He is now, 37 years later, Yale's only current professor to have won the university's unofficial Triple Crown, the Sterling Chair for Scholarship, the Devane Medal for Teaching, and the Lamar Award for Alumni Service. His work has won awards from both the American Bar Association and the Federalist Society. And he's been cited by Supreme Court justices in more than 40 cases. As he says in his punchy way, tops in his generation. As an academic, he is patently the rare thing, a true scholar teacher. And not only that, a public intellectual of the best sort. One who can convey weighty ideas in a compelling and clear way. Not incidentally a trait ordinarily known, that lawyers are ordinarily known for. Here is one pithy example from a recent book chapter titled Founding Myths, commenting on the legacy of Charles Beard's economic interpretation of the Constitution. Quote, "Beard is bunk," closed quote. And you can follow his similarly pithy Twitter remarks at Akhil Reed Amar, and listen to his weekly podcast, America's Constitution, or even gain access to his public lectures and free courses at akhilamar.com. But his latest and most ambitious book is The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation, 1760 to 1840. The most recent in a long series of volumes whose topical fulcrum is American constitutionalism. Listen to some of their titles. And some of you I know have read these books because it came up during lunch conversation. The Constitution Today, The Law of the Land, a grand tour of our constitutional republic. America's Unwritten Constitution. America's Constitution, a biography. The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction. The Constitution and Criminal Procedure First Principles. Throughout the stream of books and articles and lectures and interviews and podcasts, and yes, even tweets, he's been laboring to give Americans what he insists we need, and might I add, what our students above all need. In his words, quote, "Facts and analysis, not reflexive right-wing boosterism or knee-jerk leftist hooting." So we're all in for a provocative lecture on the patrimony of the U.S. Constitution. And please join me in extending a warm Madison Foundation welcome to Professor Akhil Reed Amar.
Thank you, Jack.
Okay. Lou is suggesting that we turn this on.
It's such an honor to be with a group of fellow teachers. And I thank you for your service. That's something that we conventionally, and I hope sincerely, say when we meet those who have put their bodies in harm's way for the rest of us in our military. But American service also involves centrally teaching the story of America to the next generation. And you are all servants in that way. And I'm very grateful to you and our country. I'd be very grateful to you because, candidly, it's not the most remunerative of professions. It's absolutely necessary. And if we don't do, we fellow teachers, the work that we do, I think in the end, America is lost. because the only thing that we have in common really as Americans is our national narrative, our story, our history. And so we have to get it right. Because here's what we don't have in common. We don't have race in common. Americans come from many different races and ethnicities. Our great-grandparents come from all parts of the world. They came at different times to modern-day America. Some came in chains. Some came with bullwhips. Some came yesterday. So we don't have race or ethnicity. We disagree politically, and we have religious diversity of an extraordinary sort. So what is it that we have in common? We have our Constitution, our history, our narratives, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today, and you'll decide for yourself whether you agree or disagree with my revised narrative. But I just want to begin by thanking you for your service, because you in turn are teaching the next generation. And if they don't learn this stuff, then they have nothing in common. And then America flies apart. Maybe the project dies, not to be too dramatic, but I think that's actually a real possibility unless we do what we do. So thank you. This is the James Madison Lecture officially, but it's a little bit awkward because some of you, by the time you hear what I have to say, might think that this is the anti-James Madison Lecture. And the question is, was James Madison truly the father of the Constitution? I'm wearing a tie. It has a kind of generic, it has a founding father on it, and it's not quite clear if you look at it. Is that Madison? Is that Hamilton? Is that Jefferson? Is that Washington? It's not quite Ben Franklin, not quite John Adams, but who is it? And I'm not sure. But most of you have been taught what I was taught, was that, well, of course, it's that James Madison is the father of the Constitution, and I'm going to call that into question today. Another way of putting the point is to remind you that, kind of by tradition, by acclamation, there are 6 particularly extraordinary founding fathers. The first 4 presidents: Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, plus Hamilton and Franklin. And the book that I've just recently finished, and I see some of you have it, and thank you so much for that, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversations, 1760 to 1840, does feature those founding fathers and the larger cast of Americans who produced those founding fathers and backed them in key ways, and that influenced them and that were influenced by them. So it's a top-down story in certain ways, but also a bottom-up story in other ways. But we Americans we like rankings, who's up and who's down, and who's number one, whether it's in hockey or basketball or football or even academic programs are ranked. So we rank founding fathers. So who really is the father of the Constitution? And conventionally, we are told it's James Madison. And as I said, in this anti-James Madison lecture, I want to basically offer a different point of view. So I'm going to read you some passages not from the book, but from an essay that I composed for a slightly different purpose, but I think will be just perfect for our conversation today. And it's an essay on founding myths. And it's from a forthcoming book called Myth America. It's kind of a pun on Miss America. That is in which I have one chapter, and there are many other chapters written by eminent historians of other periods. Those who misunderstand the founding are apt to misread the Constitution. Alas, Americans from all educational strata and all points on the political compass routinely misinterpret this critical era and in the process muddy the letter and spirit of our supreme law of the land. Here are 5 especially widespread and interrelated misunderstandings, each followed by a brief statement of the myth-busting truth of the matter. Myth 1, James Madison was the father of the Constitution. And I say, so here's the thesis. No, that would be George Washington, and paternity matters. So he's not just the father of the country, he's the father of the Constitution, and the two are connected, you see. Myth 2, the key Federalist essay is Madison's Federalist number 10. Okay, yeah, that's what you were taught. No, almost no one read that Madison essay in the 1780s or indeed in the ensuing century. The key Federalist essays in the ratification era were John Jay's and Alexander Hamilton's numbers 2 to 8, explaining the Washingtonian and geostrategic essence of the Federalist Plan. Myth 3, the framers believed in republics but disdained democracy. No, despite certain language that appeared in Madison's Federalist number 10, these two words were more synonymous than oppositional in general 1780s discourse. Regardless of the label we now choose to use, the framers believed in and practiced popular self-government. Myth 4, the Constitution was indeterminate on, and perhaps even supportive of, secession. Ridiculous. Washington's geostrategic Constitution categorically repudiated unilateral state secession. So this is very much a Lincoln point as well as a Washington-Hamilton point, and a Madison point as well. Myth 5, the Constitution was designed by the rich for the rich. Not really. The document was just what it said it was, a text ordained by the people, not the property. Or, as you've already heard said, beard is bunk. Let's begin by popping a trio of interrelated bubbles about James Madison, the Federalist 10, and the linguistic innovation that Madison introduced in that now famous ratification essay, which sharply contradistinguished republics from democracies. Many today view Madison as the father of the Constitution. But when the Grand Philadelphia Convention met in the summer of 1787 to propose a solution to the myriad and interlocking failures of America's first continental legal system, the sagging Articles of Confederation, few Americans had even heard of the diminutive Confederation congressman. So I'm a really short guy and I think about stuff like that. And we short people, we get no respect. Okay. By contrast, everyone knew of George Washington, the legendary commander-in-chief who had won the Revolutionary War and then disbanded his army rather than trying to make himself king, as had William the Conqueror, or Lord Protector, as had Oliver Cromwell, or Emperor, as had Augustus Caesar, and as would Napoleon. And by the way, in case you missed the point, Washington is tall. Washington's thrilling act of Republican renunciation and self-restraint had inspired contemporaries high and low the world over. In fact, there's this famous story in which actually George III says, well, what's Washington going to do with his army? And someone says he's going to disband it. And George III says, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And he did do that. And he was the greatest man in the world. The Philadelphia Convention had broad popular credibility in America, mainly because Washington, bowing to public opinion, reluctantly agreed to suspend his retirement to attend the grand gathering. So the convention is significant because Washington's there, not because Madison's there. The convention that ensued was Washington's convention, not Madison's. Likewise, the proposed constitution that emerged was emphatically Washington's. At the conclave's outset, the delegates unanimously made Washington their presiding officer. His title at Philadelphia, Mr. President, would because he's the presiding officer, you see, his title at Philadelphia, Mr. President, would poetically become his title under the Constitution itself. Most of the delegates had borne arms in the war, A third were veterans of Washington's Continental Army, and 5 of the 55 delegates, one from each of 5 distinct states out of the 12 that met in Philadelphia, Rhode Island boycotted the event, had personally served as Washington's aides de camp. These former aides were obviously Washington's men, not Madison's. New York's Alexander Hamilton, Pennsylvania's Thomas Mifflin, Maryland's James McHenry, Virginia's Edmund Randolph, and South Carolina's Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. So maybe just to put it in modern terminology, since we meet on the day after Stephen Breyer stepped down from the Supreme Court to be replaced by one of his former law clerks, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and you heard that way back when I clerked for then Judge Breyer back in Boston, Washington is surrounded by his law clerks, basically, his military clerks. And there are only 12 states there, and he's got a man in each of 5 separate state delegations, okay? So he's gonna get what he wants, and he does. Compared to, the document that emerged from this conclave was also obviously Washington's. The Philadelphia Constitution's primary goal was geostrategic. The fledgling American regime needed to create a strong and indivisible union able to defend itself against Europe's great powers. England, France, Spain, I might even add Russia, which is on the western edge of the continent, and since we're thinking these days about Putin, okay, the goal was to create an indivisible union able to defend itself against these great European powers, each of which still coveted New World land and thus posed a potentially existential threat. We forget that because America is so strong today, but back then it was much more vulnerable. Long before he even knew Madison, Washington had emphasized the need for such an indivisible union, most dramatically in his initial farewell address, a world-famous circular letter to America's governors in 1783, where he disbands the army and becomes the most famous man in the world because he just goes back to his farm and surrenders his sword, when he could have made himself king, czar, emperor, what have you, Lord Protector. Compared to Revolution-era state constitutions, which provided the basic template for the Philadelphia Plan's bicameral and tripartite federal system, the most distinctive element of the proposed new federal constitution was its astonishingly powerful chief executive. So here's what I just told you. It's not actually the great man at Philadelphia. What they're actually doing is distilling the template that has already emerged up and down the continent in the state constitutions. They're basically just coming up with best state practices on issue after issue, and that's going to be the federal constitution, borrowing from the existing state constitutions that are already out there. But the most different element, the thing that makes the federal constitution really different than the state constitutions, which are written constitutions, bicameral, except in a couple places, Pennsylvania, Georgia, tripartite, legislature, executive, judiciary. That's in the state constitutions, that's the federal. So the big difference, the only really big difference, is this astonishingly powerful chief executive, infinitely more powerful than any state governor. Okay. America's newly minted president could win election independently of Congress, whereas in the states, 8 of the 13 pick their chief executive, you see, by the legislature, parliament style, Boris Johnson style. Okay, you could win election independently of Congress, and thereafter win infinite and independent re-election, so no term limits, a bunch of states have term limits, would enjoy a long, by 1787 gubernatorial standards, term of office, 4 years. No one has 4 years among the governors. Would wield a remarkably powerful pair of veto and pardon pens. Only in Massachusetts does the governor have a pardon pen, and he serves for 1 year at a time. You see, so this is, veto and they don't have powerful pardon pens. And we're just seeing how pardons can be important or not. right now. Okay, veto pen, pardon pen, and no governor has this powerful combination, would command a continental army and navy, and will also stand atop all other executive departments that would eventually emerge. He gets to pick his underlings, unlike councils who are sometimes foisted on governors in the various states. They don't get to pick their cabinets, their councils. The Philadelphia delegates undeniably designed this office for the trusted Washington, who would ultimately win unanimous election and re-election as America's first president. So just think about that. Every single elector votes for George Washington and then votes again for George Washington. It's like, how could you ever have thought, how could I ever have thought it was James Madison? I mean, and I'm not done yet, but just, add those facts up together. Madison, by contrast, would fail to win the U.S. Senate seat he coveted and would struggle even to secure a House seat. Okay? Prior to Philadelphia, Madison had given no real thought to how federal executive power should be structured, as he candidly admitted in a mid-April 1787 letter to Washington. And here's a pro tip to all of you teachers out there. You can see these letters for yourself. They're free and online, and to our C-SPAN audience. Our tax dollars at work in the National Archives Founders Online Project. It's word searchable. You can find every letter ever written to or from the six major founding fathers. And there's other stuff too, but anything ever written to or from or between Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, Hamilton. It's all there for and it's to you to find, for you to assign to your students. It's word searchable. Amazing. And you'll find so if I just tell you, even without giving the footnote, a mid-April 1787 letter, it's from Madison to Washington. You can find it, there may be only two that Madison sent. And Madison confesses, like, I don't know a clue about executive power. I haven't really thought about it very much. And Washington's thinking to himself, well, I've thought about it a time or two. And that's the news in the Constitution, the really powerful presidency, which you see could end the republic. That's why we have to be really careful when we pick presidents. That's what makes the US Constitution different than its state constitutional counterparts. And that's all Washington and no Madison. True, in the run-up to Philadelphia, Madison had pondered certain other features of his hoped-for Constitution. He favored a bicameral federal legislature flanked by an independent executive and an independent judiciary. But this was old hat in 1787. Most revolutionary state constitutions followed some version of this basic template, a template endorsed by both New York's John Jay and Massachusetts' Henry Knox in early 1787 letters that reached Washington well before Madison sent the general his own preferred plan. And again, you can see all this in the National Archives online collection. Note that all three men were advising Washington, not vice versa. Well before Philadelphia, everyone understood that Washington was, in modern parlance, the man. Another defining element of the eventual Constitution, its ratification by the American people, was foreshadowed by Washington himself no later than mid-1783, when he barely knew Madison. See, because that's another big thing. Really strong presidency, putting it to a vote. These are Washington ideas. Although Madison did bring some original ideas to the Philadelphia conclave, most of his pet projects fell by the wayside. And as a short little academic, I can so relate. I have all these ideas, and people say, well, thank you for your thoughts. Madison argued relentlessly for a Senate that, like the House, would be apportioned by population. He lost. He argued tirelessly for a congressional negative, that is, a veto over state law. He lost again. He wanted leading judges to join the president in wielding the veto power, as New York had it. Here, too, he lost. He pleaded for broad federal power to tax exports. Yet again, he lost. Are you getting the picture? Prior to the ratification process, his biggest achievement was, in a word, Washingtonian. Along with others, he had played a key role in cajoling Washington to suspend retirement and attend the Philadelphia conclave. So that's his biggest contribution, is getting Washington to show up. When the convention adjourned and its plan became public, an epic challenge loomed ahead. Americans up and down the continent would need to ratify the plan in specially elected conventions chosen by uniquely inclusive electorates. What the framers envisioned in late 1787 and what in fact unfolded over the ensuing year, contrabeard, you see, was nothing less than the most democratic deed that had ever occurred up to that point in the planet's history. Up and down a whole freaking continent, voting on the thing and talking about it. My gosh. Never before had so many persons over so large a landmass been invited to assent so explicitly to the basic ground rules that would govern themselves and their posterity. Once done, this explosive deed would change the world in a big bang that would radiate out both across the centuries in American history and oceans geographically, leading to many later and even more democratic American amendments, and eventually giving rise to today's world in which democracies govern most of the planet's inhabitants. Our modern world, which is a democratic world, was made in America, because before this, it wasn't a democratic world. Okay, and it's putting it to a vote, and Washington is thinking about this as early as 1783, when he's barely heard of Madison. In the year that changed everything, this hinge of human history, it was Washington's world-famous name that loomed the largest and carried the Philadelphia plan to victory. The fact that Washington endorsed the plan and the expectation that he would lead the new government counted for more than all the other speeches and writings of all the other backers of the plan put together. In a brief letter to the Confederation Congress summarizing the proposed plan on behalf of the convention, a letter reprinted alongside the envisioned Constitution in tens of thousands of copies circulated among the citizenry, Washington explained the main lines and aims of the new system. So that's what everyone reads, not the Federalist Papers, and definitely not Federalist 10, which I'll come back to. Okay, this key letter, so it accompanies the written Constitution everywhere. And it's printed in all the newspapers up and down the continent. This key letter made clear that the proposed Constitution, if ratified, would end state sovereignty and unite America into a strong union necessary to solve the basic problems of continental government that threaten the very survival of independent America. This is a quote. "The friends of our country," wrote Washington, "have long seen and desired that the power of making war, peace, and treaties, that of levying money and regulating commerce, and the corresponding executive and judicial authorities should be fully and effectually vested in the general government of the Union," unquote. But he noted it would obviously be improper to, quote, "delegate such extensive trust to one body of men," unquote. That is a unicameral Congress combining legislative, executive, and judicial power, like we had under the Articles of Confederation. "Hence results," he wrote, "the necessity of a different organization, namely a new modeled bicameral and tripartite system at the federal level akin to the governments of each individual state." Back now to Washington's letter. Quote, "It is obviously impracticable in the federal government of these states," that is the national regime, "to secure all rights of independent sovereignty to each state, and yet provide for the interests and safety of all," unquote. In other words, individual state sovereignty, the bedrock principle of the Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation, now needed to yield. In all our, this is back to Washington, in all our deliberations on this subject, we kept steadily in our view that which appears to us the greatest interest of every true American, the consolidation of our union, in which is involved our prosperity, felicity, safety, perhaps our national existence. Unite or die is what he's saying, building on Franklin. For years, Washington had been preaching precursors of this sermon to anyone who would listen. This was also the basic message of a series of newspaper essays that first appeared in New York under the pen name Publius, eventually numbering 85 essays and repackaged into a 2-volume book published in the spring of 1788. The Federalist was the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, who enlisted John Jay and James Madison to join him in this joint pseudonym. 7 of the first 8 essays, the Federalist numbers 2 through 8, authored by Hamilton and Jay, explain in vivid detail the key geostrategic argument for a newly minted and indivisible union, along the lines that Washington and Hamilton in particular had been advocating for many years. As Jay, writing as Publius, explained in the Federalist number 5, this union was expressly modeled on the indissoluble geostrategic, quote, entire and perfect, unquote, entire perfect union, unquote, of Scotland and England 80 years earlier. Britain was free and strong, Hamilton Publius argued in the Climactic Federalist number 8, because it was a defensible island protected by the English Channel. Okay? By uniting indissolubly, Americans could likewise be free and strong, protected by the Atlantic Ocean. Land borders between continental European nation states had led to standing armies, military dictators, and horrific bloodshed on the continent itself. You know, the French whomping on the Germans and their whomping back and so on. International land borders between 13 sovereign American states or between several regional confederacies or nation states would ultimately lead to the same fate in the New World. The states thus need to merge into one indivisible and continental nation state, as Scotland and England had merged in 1707 to form the mighty British nation. So in a nutshell, why is Britain strong and free? Because it's an island. Scotland and England have united because before they've done that, you know, the Scots are whomping on the English, and the English are whomping back, and Mel Gibson is coming down, and Mary, Queen of Scots, is getting involved, and no one is free in that world. Okay, but unite the place. Now it only needs a navy. Navies are less threatening to domestic liberty. They can only pound a coastline, and Americans could just retreat past the coastline. We want to create, you know, an islands nation of a certain sort, like Britain. It's like that scene in When Harry Met Sally, when the Meg Ryan character, when Sally says, "I'll have what she's having." And so we want to be like the Brits, okay? They've got an English Channel. We're going to have the Atlantic Ocean that will protect us. This was the main argument that persuaded open-minded, fence-sitting Americans in 1787-88. It was the argument that a farmer or a tradesman could understand in response to his obvious questions. This is what any American would ask. Like, why do we need to go beyond sovereign states and try to create a continental republic, the likes of which, a continental republic, you see, the likes of which have never been seen in human history? The only republics before then are tiny little city-states like Athens, pre-imperial Rome. Given that most of history's successful republics have been small, which is a point popularized by the French writer Montesquieu, and given that the world until now, our sovereign state, New York, Massachusetts, what have you, has never been indissolubly linked to any other sovereign state, why must we become continental? You know, it'd be like today proposing world government with like a president of the world and an army of the world, and they can tax you directly and regulate you. There's only one reason today you'd ever vote for that. Martians. Men in black, and then you'd say, well, we've got our issues with the Russians and the Chinese actually, you know, they're not always on our side, but you know, what the hell, they're Homo sapiens, we're in, let's roll, let's kick some in. That's the argument. You see, it's a new, it's a continental, it's a new plan for an entire new world separated by vast moats from the rest of the world. That's what's being proposed, and it's scary as hell to ordinary people. And the early Federalist papers are saying, here's why you have to do that, because if you don't, you'll die, okay? Because, in a word, Putin, you know, or George III, or Louis, or whomever, okay? That's why. Madison Publius had his own answer to these questions in the Federalist number 10, the Mass Virginia's first contribution to the collaborative project. This answer was not geostrategic. It did not fit with the main outlines of the Washington-Hamilton-Jay solution to the Confederation crisis, but rather aimed to offer a different reason to vote yes on the proposed Constitution. Madison's essay built on the most original ideas that he had pitched to Philadelphia, most of which lost, and in college courses today, or in high school courses, this essay is widely taught for its intriguing claims about democracy, demography, representation, majority rule, minority rights, property rights, factionalism, and governmental economies of scale, arguing that the new federal government would likely protect minority rights better than would individual states, because majority tyranny would be harder to pull off in a large and diverse democracy, and because continental lawmakers would likely be men of greater wisdom than would state legislators. This essay foreshadowed much of post-Civil War American history. It's brilliant, it deserves tenure. It's a great piece. But in 1787-88, almost no one paid attention to Madison's masterpiece. The early geostrategic Federalist essays were widely reprinted. The Federalist 10 was not. Unlike the main ideas of the Federalist numbers 2 to 8, Madison's concepts in number 10 were not echoed in other newspaper pieces or by authors or by speakers in ratifying conventions. Number 10 failed to make a deep impression in American coffee houses and taverns where patrons read aloud and discussed both local and out-of-town newspapers. If Publius had a great answer to the farmer tradesman's basic question, why a truly continental nation state, the best place to give that answer in a newspaper would be in the first few essays, not the 10th. If you had a great answer to that question, would you wait till your 10th op-ed to make it? Of course you wouldn't. And they didn't. They led with their strong argument, which is Hamiltonian, Washingtonian, geostrategic. The only Madison essay that was widely reprinted in 1787-88, and oh, by the way, you can confirm all of this. There's this amazing online project. It's called the Documentary History of the Ratification of the Constitution. It's online and free, 26 volumes, and you can do word searches, and they will tell you which essays were reprinted, how frequently, where, and when, so you can confirm all the things I'm telling you now in just 5 minutes at a laptop, which is amazing. The only Madison essay that was widely reprinted in 1787-88, the Federalist number 14, opened with a nice recapitulation of the geostrategic argument, an argument that Madison plainly endorsed, even though he had some other more original ideas that he had to get off his chest. One of these ideas was that popular government, based on the concept of representation, could operate over a much larger area and population than could systems of direct democracy in which voters met in person to legislate, most notably ancient Athenian assemblies and New England town meetings. Aiming to blunt Montesquieu's famous claim, emphasized at every turn by anti-federalist skeptics of the Philadelphia Plan, that truly self-governing societies could work only over small areas, Madison introduced his now famous, but not then, distinction between republics and democracies. The latter, that is, democracies, relied on direct and daily citizen participation. And as to them, said Madison, Montesquieu had a point, but republics, based on smaller representative assemblies, could span large distances and encompass large populations, Madison argued. And it was a brilliant argument, but again, how many people were following it? The distinction between small representative assemblies and large citizen participation assemblies was then and remains now a powerful one. Indeed, this point was hardly unique to Madison in 1787, but others at the time did not routinely equate republics with representation or democracy with pure populism. On the contrary, many other Americans at the time tended to treat the words republic and democracy as broadly synonymous. A democracy could be either direct or indirect. Perhaps the word democracy was slightly edgier, much as it's edgier today to call someone a left-winger rather than a liberal. But Madison's sharp distinction between republics and democracies was his own innovation, and it was not widely embraced. Madison himself knew this. In number 10, he referred to, quote, a republic by which I mean, unquote, not a republic by which is generally meant. In number 14, he confessed that, quote, the prevalent understanding confounds a republic with a democracy. As other people are equating these two things, and I'm, Madison carefully trying to distinguish. Sure enough, Madison's contemporaries often casually referred to England's House of Commons and state lower houses, all of which relied on the principle of representation, as particularly democratic or democratical elements of their respective constitutions. Conversely, late 18th century republics could indeed make use of certain forms of direct political participation, as had, for example, Massachusetts in ratifying its state constitution in 1780 and its general tradition of town meetings. Ancient Greek governments, which had practiced various forms of direct democracy, were also commonly described as republics, a description that appeared in 3 of the 4 Federalist essays immediately preceding Madison's stipulated definition number 10. And again, it's online, you can do a word search and confirm all that. At the same time that Madison was drawing his fine linguistic distinction, other leading Federalists were obliterating it, proclaiming that a Republican government could be either directly or indirectly democratic. In the Philadelphia Ratifying Convention, the brilliant James Wilson, a Philadelphia alumnus widely viewed as America's ablest lawyer, explicitly equated a republic with a democracy. Wilson went on repeatedly and proudly to pronounce the Constitution democratic and democratical. In a proper republic/democracy, this is what Wilson says, either one, potato, potato, the people at large retain the supreme power and act either collectively or by representation. The Constitution met this test, Wilson declared. Here's a quote, "All authority of every kind is derived by representation from the people, and this democratic, not Republican, democratic principle is carried into every part of the government." So that's Pennsylvania. Now in South Carolina, Charles Pinckney says pretty much the same thing. A Republican government is one in which, quote, "the people at large either collectively or by representation form the legislature," unquote. Echoing Wilson, future Chief Justice, so that's South Carolina, and now here's Virginia. I'm just giving you sort of north and south. This is John Marshall of Virginia. He repeatedly sang the praises of democracy in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. Here are quotes from him. Quote, "Supporters of the Constitution are firm friends of the liberty and the rights of mankind. We, sir, idolize democracy. We admire the proposed Constitution because we think it is a well-regulated democracy. We contend for a well-regulated democracy." So that's not actually this sharp distinction between republics and democracy that you've all been teaching your students. When the word democracy appeared in the founding era, it was often associated with rather than defined against republicanism, even by Madison himself. What he calls in the Federalist Papers the Republican remedy for the Republican disease, actually in his Philadelphia Convention notes, he calls the Democratic remedy for the Democratic disease. In the 1790s, when various pro-Madison, pro-Jefferson groups sprang up, they called themselves Republican societies or Democratic societies or Democratic Republican societies. Potato, potato, whatever. They're the same basic idea. The political party that Madison and Thomas Jefferson created in this decade was variously described as the Republican Party and the Democratic Republican Party. Thus, today's Democratic Party claims the Republican, Jefferson, as one of its founders. Okay, so you've been taught that, oh, democracy is a dirty word. If it's a dirty word, why does the most powerful and successful political party in antebellum America, that's Jackson's party, call themselves the Democrats? See, if this so it'd be like today, oh, we're gonna find a new political party and we're gonna call ourselves the Nazis. Oh, because that's a great trademark. No, it actually isn't. And this is why I'm a Democrat, but I actually do not call myself a socialist. I think that's a big mistake for us Democrats. I don't even like progressive, truthfully. What's wrong with good old-fashioned liberal? But democracy is not a dirty word. They're not running away from it at all. With the foregoing myth-busting account in mind, we can now quickly pop a pair of related myths about secession and plutocracy. On secession, recall that the key Federalist essays, the ones that were widely reprinted and loudly echoed in the several state ratification debates, were the essays that preceded and immediately followed number 10, not number 10 itself, which veered off on a tangent. The main Federalist argument in these influential essays was a Washingtonian, he's the man, geostrategic argument that emphatically repudiated the idea that any individual state, post-ratification, could unilaterally leave the Union. The Federalist number 5 thus made clear that a model for USA 2.0 was the indissoluble union of England and Scotland. Now, just to anticipate a question some of you might have, there's talk today of Scottish secession, but it's basic British law that secession can't be unilateral. Britain as a whole would have to agree to any Scottish exit, Skexit, or whatever you want to call it. Post-1707 Britain was free and strong, argued Publius in the early Federalist essays, precisely because Britons had eliminated internal land borders and internal armies. America needed to follow the same model for the same reason, explained the Federalist number 8. Thus, the Federalist number 11 expressly described the new plan as one for a strict and indissoluble union. Were unilateral state secession legally permissible, any state at any future date could ally with any foreign European monarchy of its own choosing and thereby threaten its land-bordering neighbors with an army buttressed by European monarchs, murderers, and mercenaries. Any such alliance would obviously imperil the entire Washingtonian project, which envisioned a largely demilitarized America, which Americans would never need a large army to guard, say, Maryland and points north from Virginia or Virginia from the Carolinas. So I wrote this a while back, but just imagine today if South Carolina or any other state could leave the Union, make an alliance with Putin, and now we have Russian soldiers in the Carolinas, which is not where you want them. You know, you want them halfway across the world, as far away from us as possible. And that's the Washingtonian idea. That's the early Federalist Papers. That's why we formed the Constitution. It's not Madison's Federalist 10, which is great. I give him tenure. He's a great little academic, you know, but that's not, you know, and yes, I feel this personally, but that's not actually what the key idea was. The text of the Constitution and its ratification history were utterly clear on this point. Article 6 proclaimed the Constitution the supreme law of the land, regardless of what any state in the future might say or do unilaterally. No ifs, ands, or buts. You're in the classroom with kids, you know, some of you, or most of you are parents, I'm a parent. You know, sometimes I look at my kids, they're all in college now, and I'd say, what part of no did you not understand? You know, like, what part of the Supremacy Clause, South Carolina, do you not understand? It's the supreme law of the land, period. Full stop. Anyone who took up arms against America, even if backed by his home state, or I would add, his president, would be committing treason, said Article 3. And you know why I said that thing, because of January 6th. The Constitution pointedly dropped the emphatic language of the Articles of Confederation, which proclaimed that each state was sovereign. That's what the Articles of Confederation about. Been there, done that. We're repudiating that. An enormously consequential omission duly noted by all the leading anti-federalists. You know, so if I say to you, I love you, and you don't say I love you back, oh, you know, that I'm going to notice that. You know, it says states are sovereign in the Articles, doesn't say that in the Constitution. Oh, people are going to kind of notice something like that, don't you think? Okay, in the same spirit, Article 5 dropped the Confederation's rules that future amendments would require state unanimity. Such a rule made sense for a pure league of sovereign states, the Confederation, but made no sense for a newly modeled Washingtonian system in which states would no longer be sovereign, as they once had been. The new plan was exactly what it said it was, not a league, not a confederation, not a treaty of sovereign states, but a true and indivisible constitution, obviously modeled on contemporaneous state constitutions. And in turn, those state constitutions were universally understood as internally indivisible. No one thought in 1787 that Boston could unilaterally secede from Massachusetts or that Charleston could unilaterally exit from South Carolina. And now we're going to do continentally what we had done before, state by state by state. In the ratification process, and these are all Washington themes, anti-federalists everywhere highlighted the proposed Constitution's indivisibility and urged Americans to think twice and then thrice more before agreeing to such an audacious and unilaterally irreversible plan. In response, leading Federalists across the continent, in both speech and print, expressly avowed indivisibility and routinely highlighted the analogy to the indivisible union of Scotland and England some 80 years earlier. Here's the key aha fact. Never in the entire year of ratification did any leading Federalist suggest that a state could unilaterally leave the new union, even though such an assurance would doubtless have made it much easier for states' rights men to say yes. If there's a money-back guarantee, why wouldn't you say so? Prominently in the document and in the conversation. And you can check me on this. It's all word searchable. 26 big fat volumes of actually conversation, the documentary history project. You won't find any Federalist saying this, not one. In the New York Ratifying Convention, compromise-minded anti-Federalists offered to vote yes, so long as the state could reserve a right to withdraw from the Union over the next few years if no federal Bill of Rights materialized. So they're proposing compromise. We'll say yes, but if there's no Bill of Rights, then we want to be able to leave. Okay. Federalists flatly rejected this proffered compromise. At the risk of losing the entire state, Federalists insisted that the state convention must ratify cleanly with no attempted reservation of secession right. Hamilton read aloud a letter from Madison on this key point. Quote, and this is Madison's words, but they're read aloud at the New York Ratifying Convention. The Constitution requires an adoption in toto and forever. It has been so adopted by all the other states, including Madison's Virginia. Hamilton and Jay went on to elaborate the key point in their own words. The Constitution's required oath to the document itself as the supreme law of land, quote, stands in the way, unquote, of any purported secession right. This is another quote, a reservation of a right to withdraw was inconsistent with the Constitution and was no ratification. It won't count. It has to be yes or no, in or out, deal or no deal. As Hamilton, Jay, and Madison made these points unequivocally clear, all America was watching breathlessly. Is there going to be a gun legislation in DC or not? Are they going to be able to come up with a plan or not? Okay, everyone's watching. Would Federalist insistence on this bedrock, non-negotiable point doom the deal? In the end, the New York Ratifying Convention said yes by the narrowest of margins. Newspapers in virtually every state, including notably Virginia and both Carolinas, covered the cliffhanger in detail. Americans everywhere in 1787-88, the hinge of human history, the year that changed everything, understood exactly what they were agreeing to and why. How can it be that so many Americans today miss the central argument of the key Federalist essays and the key Federalists? Much of the blame lies with Charles Beard, who in 1913 wrote the single most influential 20th century book on the Constitution. Beard's ambitious and widely read economic interpretation of the Constitution argued, in effect, that the Constitution was an undemocratic quasi-coup foisted on America by a wealthy elite, a document by and for the one percenters, so to speak. Modern neo-Beardians of various stripes tell a dark founding story that goes something like this. So this is the world according to Howard Zinn, and it's completely wrong. And I don't care what Matt Damon thinks. He's the guy who's trying to get you to buy, Bitcoin or whatever. So, don't listen to him in Good Will Hunting. This is the basic story, and this is what our students are being taught. This is what my kids were being taught in school, and I'm trying to say this is crap. Kids are saying, chill, Dad. Okay. This is the basic sort of narrative. And it's coming from Beard. And whether you're aware of it or not, all your teachers and their teachers, this is what influenced them, this book. But it's wrong on its facts. It's bunk. Well-heeled delegates, this is the counter story that I'm basically saying is a myth. Well-heeled delegates met in secret and exceeded their limited instructions to modify the Articles of Confederation, not scrap them entirely. These plotters then pressured/bamboozled America into accepting a document designed mainly to protect private property and fat cat creditors and to suppress incipient movements for economic justice, for debtor relief laws, paper money laws, and the like, movements that were beginning to gain traction in the state governments that were, in Federalist eyes, unduly democratic. Madison's Federalist number 10 was Exhibit A for Beard and his legions of followers. On the Beardian reading, number 10 dissed democracy and stressed property rights and incipient class conflict. Madison was a kind of Marxian analyst avant la lettre. Although, of course, he was on the side of the ruling class contra the emerging proletariat. That's the Beardian take. States in this reading were more threatening to minority rights than the larger, wider-ranging federal government would be, and the all-important representation principle would likely lead to an elite federal Congress that would be less vulnerable to mass pressure for economic redistribution than were the more numerous, less refined, more democratic and demagogic state legislatures. Now, there is a touch of truth in this dark Beardian tale, but also massive myth-making. Recall that no one at the time paid much attention to the Federalist number 10. So it matters if you think 10 is the key or not, and you're missing what really is the key, the geostrategic argument. Indeed, almost no leading politician or scholar paid much heed to number 10 in the ensuing century and a quarter, even as many other Federalist essays did feature prominently in America's ongoing constitutional conversation. Beard almost single-handedly vaulted Madison's intriguing essay to the forefront of American constitutional discourse. Douglas Adair proved this 75 years ago. The documentary history proves that no one's talking about it at the time. You can do a word search, and other things were talked about. Adair comes along and says, next 125 years, no one's talking about Federalist 10. Beard makes it front and center, and that's why you're all teaching Federalist 10, you see, whether you knew it or not. Like, that's why. But now I'm coming along and saying there's a different narrative that I want you to be aware of, and you'll have to decide for yourselves, my friends. Aside from the details of who read which Federalist essay when, a much larger question looms. Was the Constitution itself, as Beard and Neo-Beardians claim, fundamentally anti-democratic? Okay, so this is Howard Zinn and Matt Damon and that crowd. Was it fundamentally anti-democratic? Hardly. The Constitution did not say we the property, nor did it do we the property. The original document itself mentioned property only once in Article 4's reference to government property, not private property. More important, the Constitution was put to an epic we the people vote with especially democratic procedures and protocols. In 8 of the 13 states, ordinary property qualifications, either to vote for convention delegates or to run as a delegate or both, were lowered or eliminated. So in 8 of the states, they're lowering property qualifications to vote on the Constitution. In no state were property qualifications raised for this special once-in-a-lifetime ratification experience. In New York, for example, all adult, free male citizens could vote for convention delegates. No race tests, no property tests, no religious tests, no literacy tests. These were not the rules for ordinary New York elections. Rather, they were special rules, especially democratic rules, designed for an especially democratic ratification process. We the people indeed. That is, indeed. This is what we actually did. Beard knew these facts and hid them from his readers. That's a very strong statement, and I back it up in endnotes, that he knew it and he hid it from you. Later Beardians either did not know these facts or did not care. The facts came to light only in 2005 in another ambitious and widely read academic tome, America's Constitution, a Biography. And some of you are giggling because you know who read that. And in the end, and in the footnotes, I actually say, disclosure, I wrote that book. But until I wrote that book, no one knew these. And even my own teachers at places like Yale, because Beard knew them and he hid them and no one else actually double checked it. Double check, trust but verify. Okay, I'm coming close to the end here. True, the convention met in secrecy, but secrecy lapsed on the conclave's last day. Secrecy aimed to promote candid initial deliberation, not to suppress sordid delegate motivation. In the ensuing ratification process, many delegates openly discussed details of their earlier deliberations. So they're spilling the beans immediately after the document goes public. This too is a fact Neo-Beardians either do not know or choose not to mention. How many of you knew, because I actually didn't really clearly until I researched the most recent book, that immediately after the Philadelphia Convention ended, people talked openly about what had happened in the convention. How many of you knew that? Yeah, see, because because that's not the story. Oh, they met in secret. Yeah, until the Dobbs draft becomes public, you see. Not the leak, but the final version, and then it's out there for everyone to see, you see. But it's not just that the Constitution's out there for everyone to see. Oh, the clerks start spilling the beans too. They immediately, which they're not doing, you see, on the Supreme Court. Immediately, I said this, and then he said that, and then I responded, and then, okay, immediately after, and it hasn't been ratified yet. They're free to talk, and they do talk. Oh, they talk and talk and talk. True, the delegates went beyond their strict instructions, but diplomats and lawmakers back then did this routinely when exciting negotiating possibilities opened up, unexpectedly materialized at the bargaining table. Washington and company exceeded the letter of their instructions to fulfill the spirit of their instructions, which was, please fix the broken Confederation. Their proposal became law only after the Confederation Congress unanimously forwarded their plan to the several states, and only after the American people in state convention after state convention after state convention after state convention, said, yes, we do. If the document was truly anti-democratic, why did people vote for it? Why did tens of thousands of ordinary working men enthusiastically join massive pro-constitutional rallies in Philadelphia and Manhattan? Why did America's Electoral College vote unanimously twice to make the Constitution's father, George Washington, the renewed Union's first president? Why did voters overwhelmingly vote for Federalists in the first set of national elections? If Beard is right about all these things. Here's why. Because contra Beard, the document was remarkably democratic for its time, if we bracket for a moment the slavery issue, and I promise I'll return to that at the end. But that was an issue that Beard, interestingly, all but ignored. So I'll talk about 1619 in just a bit. Unlike the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution featured a new institution, the House of Representatives, elected directly by the people. The 1787 plan rejected property qualifications for House service, Senate service, and the presidency. No contemporaneous state did anything truly analogous. So you're going to get to vote for Congress, and there are no property qualifications. Well, that's better than the Articles of Confederation and better than the state constitutions. Wow. The Philadelphia Plan also provided for a regular census and regular reapportionment, unlike most states. The new document additionally promised that federal lawmakers would draw salaries so that even middling men, not merely the idle rich, could serve. Like a school teacher could run and serve, because you didn't need to have independent wealth. They'll pay you to be in Congress. Most states did nothing like this. In sharp contrast to the rules in most states, the Constitution promised to open government service to persons of every creed, even agnostics and atheists. Also, the Philadelphia Constitution's age rules aimed to blunt dynastic power by prohibiting the early election of famous favorite sons, while giving low-born men a chance to rise and show their stuff. This, too, was more democratic than most state constitutions. Why do you have to be 35 to be president? Well, who could be president at age 33? Who would have the name recognition, at age 33? A wealthy, famous playboy. Can you spell Trump? Okay, so age 35 was you're supposed to actually have a track, or Quincy, or a Q. You're supposed to have a track record, as in W, a track record of your own, you see. And you're going to be eligible if you're John Q or George W, but only when you have a track record of your own, rather than merely the first and last name of your daddy. Okay, and who's the prime minister when they're coming up with all these rules? His name is William Pitt, as in William Pitt the Younger, and he has the same first and last name as his daddy, and he might be good, he might be bad, but he's getting because of his daddy's name, and he's a member of parliament at 21, MP, and prime minister, PM, at 24. And they're saying, no, you've got a different model, where actually you got to do something in your own right. Remarkably democratic. Affirmative action for low-born people. If the Constitution was fundamentally democratic for its time, and here I end, does this mean it was also fundamentally anti-slavery? So it is democratic, but it is anti-slavery, and geostrategic. Is anti-slavery? No. Democracy for a given people, citizenry, and enslavement of other people's nationalities could conceptually coexist, and indeed did famously coexist for centuries in the most notable ancient democracies, republics, such as Periclean Athens or the Roman Republic. In fact, America's pro-democracy Constitution of 1787 was, sadly, also pro-slavery in its basic structure and its foreseeable effects, even though not everyone at the time, especially in the North, foresaw the foreseeable during the drafting and ratification process. The 3/5 clause gave slave states a massive advantage in the House and Electoral College, an advantage that would in turn ultimately warp the antebellum presidency, the federal judiciary, whose members were nominated by presidents, picked by the Electoral College, picked by 3/5, state legislative apportionment, Senate selection, Western expansion policy, and much more. This one little number warps everything. I will make you a deal. If you and I are writing a constitution, I will let you write every word if you let me write every number. 3/5 turns out to be huge. The pro-democracy and pro-slavery constitution that emerged under the Republican plantation owner George Washington was thus, in a word, proto-Jacksonian. In various ways, Andrew Jackson called to mind George Washington himself. Both men were deep believers in American self-government, though Jackson was not merely democratic, but often demagogic. Both men famously bested the British on the battlefield, Jackson even more decisively than Washington in the Battle of New Orleans. And both men were also, alas, Southern slaveholders. Washington was increasingly embarrassed by this fact, and in his last act, freed his slaves. Jackson was not and did not. On reflection, we should not be surprised that Jackson, a strong pro-democracy and pro-slavery president who also embodied fierce anti-secessionism and a muscular attitude toward European monarchs, would ultimately become the dominant political figure in antebellum America. After all, Jackson personified some of the Constitution's most striking structural elements: its populism, its military resilience, and also, alas, its special accommodation of slaveocracy. In sum, America's Constitution was far more democratic and geostrategic than we have been taught by 20th century neo-Beardian and neo-Madisonian mythmakers. The document's deep power structure was also, sadly, more skewed toward slavery than many mainstream scholars have been willing to admit. America's Constitution was not truly Madisonian. It was Washingtonian and proto-Jacksonian. Thank you very much. So now I think we have some time for a conversation. Is that right? How do we do this, Jeff?
Yeah, plenty of time for questions, and for the sake of the C-SPAN audience, if you have questions, please just queue up the mic.
And while you all are coming up to the mic, I'll tell you one thing. See, I'm honest with my friends. I'm maybe too blunt with my friends. This is a Madison program. So since I ended on slavery, you see, this is the story of Madison that you aren't taught, because the Madison biographers are covering up for him in the main, and I'm disappointed by that. At the beginning of their lives, Jefferson and Madison are offering up a vision of anti-slavery in the West. Jefferson is the author of an early version of the Northwest Ordinance that's going to prohibit slavery in the West. And who pushes that? And it's adopted in incarnation in the summer of 1787 by the Confederation Congress meeting in New York, at the very same moment that the delegates are meeting behind closed doors in Philadelphia. And one of the first 10 statutes passed by the new Congress, signed by George Washington, is a statute codifying the Northwest Ordinance, ending slavery in the West. And Madison helps push it through the first Congress as Washington's kind of prime minister in Congress, and Washington signs it. So really good. Jefferson and Madison are trying to end slavery in the West. And there's a part of your brain that knows that story. And you guys are very smart. There's a part of your brain that knows that in 1819, 1820, there's a Missouri Compromise which proposes to prohibit slavery north and west of a certain line. It's in effect extending the Northwest Ordinance to the lands of the Louisiana Purchase further west. Okay, well, where's Jefferson on that? He's not in favor of that. He's now in favor of diffusions, spreading the virus, to the West, because that's a brilliant idea, Jefferson, And Madison goes so far as to say not only that he doesn't really like the prohibition of slavery north of a certain line, he writes to Monroe that's unconstitutional, which is absurd. Not even John C. Calhoun takes that position. It's going to be the position of Roger Taney and Dred Scott that Congress can't prohibit slavery in the territories. It's going to lead to a civil war. And Madison, turns on a dime on this. He changes. They started out anti-slavery. They become pro-slavery. And that's not the story that's typically told. And people come up here and give the James Madison lecture, you see. And so why does he do that? He does that because in between, he's created a political party. Federalist 10 is anti-party. He's going to be the founder of the modern party. He's Karl Rove in later incarnation. That's who he is. No, he is. He's Mark Hanna. Okay. He needs to create a party because John Adams has made it a crime to criticize John Adams, because presidents can be thin-skinned that way. I'm not talking about anyone in particular today, of course. So John Adams ridiculously makes it a crime to criticize John Adams, and Jefferson and Madison create a party to stop that, and they need to, and good for them. But then that party is a Southern party. It has a Southern base. The base needs to be fed, and it's a pro-slavery base, and they go with the party against principle. You see, when it comes to extending the admirable ideas of their youth, anti-slavery, to prohibit slavery in the Louisiana territory, Madison is saying it's unconstitutional to do the very thing that he pushed, in the first Congress. That story isn't told. There's a part of your brain that maybe knows that about Jefferson and Madison in 1820, and there's a part of your brain that, knows about the Northwest Territory, but those two parts haven't talked to each other. There's a part of your brain that knows that Federalist 10 is anti-party, but there's another part of your brain that knows that Madison and Jefferson are creating a party, but they haven't talked to each other. If James Madison were alive today, the closer analogy today would not be Liz Cheney, who is choosing principle above party, and whose mother wrote an epically good, very interesting biography of James Madison, her mother, Lynn Cheney. So if Madison were alive today, he would not be like Liz Cheney, picking principle over party. He would be more like Kevin McCarthy, picking party over principle. And there are reasons to do that. I understand that. I'm a political scientist. If you think the other party is bad, you got to keep your party intact, and you're just going to stick with them no matter what. Okay? But that's not the story that you've been told. I don't know, but I'm not sure any James Madison lecturer before me has told you that story, but I do think that's the true story. And I'm going to say that here, at a James Madison event, because you're my friends, and I'm going to be straight with you.
Two things real quick. I never heard the word geostrategic in my life till I read your book, and I'm still not sure I understand the word. So if you could clarify that. But my big question is, if Washington was so determined and he's going to be the father, why did he need to be cajoled to go to the convention? Wouldn't he have felt personally compelled to go there if it was so important to him?
Brilliant questions. First, the word geostrategy. It's the same root word as geography or geology. It's a basic thought that it's about kind of land and defensibility and the globe. So yeah, it's about grand strategy or world strategy with a particular emphasis on geographic elements. In particular, it's easier to defend a coastline than it is to defend a land border. Okay, so they look around the world because they want to be democratic, and almost no place in the world has been democratic. And so they look around and say, who's democratic? Well, the Brits, to some extent, they've got elections. They've got a House of Lords no one voted for. They've got a king no one voted for, but they do have juries and elections of some sort. So they're the Brits and they're the Swiss and almost no one else. The Dutch are in the process of losing their republic. Why? In a phrase, because of defensible borders. Okay, because Britain's an island and it's hard to actually attack it, and the Swiss have the Alps. It's hard to charge up a hill. They don't know it because 1943 hasn't happened yet, when they're writing. But in 1943, you look at a map of Europe, and who's free in all of Europe? Will it be Britain and the von Trapp family in Switzerland? And that's about it. Same reason Hitler doesn't want to actually have to launch an amphibious invasion, and it's hard to charge up a hill. And so geostrategy captures the idea that they're thinking about the world, France, Britain, Russia, Spain, and they're thinking about geographic elements, like what's defensible and what's not. Land borders aren't so defensible. Putin, it's all about, he's trying to actually push across the coastline because he wants to get a land bridge to Crimea. Even today, it's about navies and armies. The Army has to be, on the Constitution, reauthorized every 2 years, but that's not true for a Navy. They are distinguishing between land and naval forces. That's the geo of a geostrategy, okay? And the strategy is they're thinking about things in a global context. And why is America free? You know, because I was taught, it's separation of powers, but, you know, Britain's pretty free and it never had a separation of powers system. And regimes that did have separate, and Juan Lintz actually thinks separation of powers, as a great political scientist, have been very bad for Latin America. You think, it's because people believe in liberty. Well, people believe in liberty in all sorts of places that don't have it. The Ukrainians believe in liberty and they're not entirely free right now. So here's why America is free. Because for the first 150 years, at least white Americans, of course, for the first 150 years, there's no standing army in peacetime of any significance in America. And so you don't need to worry about an army basically squashing you. That's why Americans are free. Meanwhile, you know, the French are fighting the Germans, 4 times in the Napoleonic Wars, the wars in the 1870s, World War I, World War II, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870s, World War I, World War II. So Americans are free because we've got this huge moat. We've created this indivisible island nation on the model of England and Scotland, and that's why we're free. And why am I telling you this today? Because now we have the largest military, industrial, and carceral complex in the world, and you should be worried about that because actually, that's not actually the world for the first 150 years. You know, so imagine just hypothetically, a crazy president with nuclear power, or with this massive. We will never have a crazy president, of course. You see, and the president is so damn powerful. That's not because of Madison, it's Washington, and you have to pay attention to that. So that's all geostrategy and how it's connected. Now, if Washington cares about all this stuff, brilliant question, why does he need to be cajoled? Why wouldn't he just run to Philadelphia? Because he has given his word. He's promised to withdraw from public life. And all the world is agog. They're all at his feet, just like he's the reincarnation of Cincinnatus, and he doesn't want to go back on his promise because, and it could all fail. Why not retire, while you're ahead? So he doesn't, he gets sucked back in because people say, you say that you actually want to save the project. Now we're going to adopt maybe a plan along the lines of your proposals, so you got to be there. And he kind of reluctantly says, yeah, you're right, but he keeps wanting to come back. So he's hoping to retire after the first term. It doesn't quite work because America hasn't come together yet. And I tell that story about how he's only able to retire after the second term, but he does. He doesn't die in office, and that's really important. He's trying to set an idea that you should actually withdraw. And his initial inclination was just to, yes, he promised to resign. And in fact, what he said is, it's not just that I promised officially the Congress to resign. He says, it's in all the newspapers. What are people going to say if I now jump back in? So that's why he needs to be persuaded. You're going to say, what are they going to say if you don't? Because your country needs you again. You uniquely. Okay.
Thank you. Like many of us, we probably have a poster in my classroom that says, James Madison, father of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Since you destroyed the first myth, I might have to take it down. But is he the father of the Bill of Rights? Would that be something more appropriate for us?
Not totally, and I did write a book called The Bill of Rights, Creation and Reconstruction, and I didn't understand the full answer when I wrote that book, and I now do a little bit more. So, first, these guys are, they are impressive, but they forget to add a Bill of Rights at Philadelphia. And I told you that the Constitution needs to be ratified. And I told you that the templates are state constitutions. The first thing ordinary farmers say, tradesmen, when they read the thing is, dudes, where are the rights? Because there's a Bill of Rights in the Virginia Constitution of 1776 and the Massachusetts Constitution 1780 and the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 and so on. And George Mason at Philadelphia toward the end says, hey, we should have a Bill of Rights and I can help draft it. And in the end, they say, thanks, George Mason, but no thanks. And he's one of the 3 people who votes no. So this was a big mistake. It almost dooms ratification. It's one of the 2 biggest objections to the Constitution. Congress is too small, and there's no Bill of Rights. So how did these geniuses miss it? Now, if you're a small d Democrat, as am I, this is about we the people, about ratification, about the wisdom of crowds, that on some things, a whole bunch of people, none of whom is a genius, may actually outperform Albert Einstein or Ben Franklin. Small group of people can make a mistake. There's wisdom in the people. Maybe not the first time around, and if we keep voting for Trump, it's on us, okay? But but in the end, the idea is democracies may make mistakes, but they'll correct them, and there's wisdom in the people. It's called famously the Condorcet's jury theorem. The more people, if you want to figure out how many jelly beans are in a jar, or how big a heifer weighs at the county fair, you could ask the smartest scientist and she or he will give you a pretty good answer, or you could poll everyone at the fair, or ideally everyone in the county, take the middle guess, you'll be very close to being right. And the more people you poll, the closer, and that's called, the Condorcet jury theorem is called the wisdom of crowds. So ordinary people, say, dude, you forgot the Bill of Rights. And so why? First, and I've never written this in print quite in this way, but they basically omitted it because they were tired and they wanted to go home. And George Mason says it's going to be quick, but he's a pain in the ass. I don't know if I can say that on C-SPAN. I just did. He's a pain in the butt, and it's going to be 2 more weeks. And you can see the wheels spinning because, what I tell my students is, they're hot and homesick. I think that's the PG version. You could say they're hot, horny, and homesick. They want to go back to their beds, their estates. They want to see their kids. They want to, pet their dogs. I'm away for a day, and I'm already thinking, I'm looking forward to getting back home. I don't want to stay in Washington, D.C. any longer than I have to. Just say so that's why they make a mistake. And Madison doesn't pivot early on this. He had a chance to support it. So why does he pivot? And who pivots first? George Washington actually pivots first. And George Washington, in his inaugural address, says we should probably have, I want you to think, why does he do that? Because half the people are for the Constitution and almost half are against it. And you want to bring everyone on board, okay? Here's what's amazing about the founding. They put it to a vote, an epic vote. They talked about it for a year up and down the continent. No one dies politically in that year. And the losers lose by this much, but they accept the verdict, okay? Wow. And no one dies politically in that year. And the losers accept. And then the winners, though, think, maybe we should actually compromise with these folks because they've actually got some good ideas. We could learn so much from that today, don't you see? So Washington wants to bring the losers on board. It's very dangerous to have half the people basically rooting against the regime. And in particular, who does he want to bring on board? North Carolina hasn't said yes. Rhode Island hasn't said yes. When he takes office as president of the United States, there are only 11 states in the Union, and those are undefensible borders. And in theory, Rhode Island and North Carolina are independent nations, and they could make a treaty, as it were, with Putin. And then you're going to have actually European mercenaries, Hessians, on American soil. So you got to get them on board, and Washington understands all of that totally, and in part for geostrategic reasons. Madison actually says some of this in the first Congress, but Washington says it first. So Madison gets it through, but Washington actually pivots, I would say, earlier than Madison, because remember, they in effect opposed a Bill of Rights at Philadelphia. Mason was the guy, who was proposing it, and they said thanks but no thanks. And it takes Madison like a year to make a pivot. He's getting all these letters from Jefferson haranguing him, and he first kind of ignores them, and Jefferson's persistent. Madison is important in the Bill of Rights, and he shapes it, and he's looking at what are the best provisions in various states and all the rest of it. So he's co-parent of it, but Washington plays a much bigger role than is conventionally understood in the Bill of Rights, and does so for geostrategic reasons, in part to bring North Carolina and Rhode Island back on board.
First of all, I want to thank you for being here and for speaking so eloquently to us today.
Thank you.
You talked a lot about the Washingtonian element, especially of the design of the executive branch. And what I'm kind of curious about is looking at the last several decades, especially perhaps the last 4 years.
The hearings in January 6th, is that what you're talking about?
Do you think that perhaps the office itself, given its Washingtonian nature at the beginning, now appears flawed? That perhaps the office itself is in need of serious reform? I wonder if you would comment on that.
Now we're talking what we need to talk about. This is a deep and hard question. Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Our nation turns its lonely light to you. Where have you gone, George Washington? Where are the George Washingtons or the Abraham Lincolns among us? Our Constitution puts so much power in one person, and it's a very vulnerable, therefore, a party system. If foreign powers can understand that and push on that, Manchurian Candidate, fictionally, that's the vulnerable spot, most vulnerable spot in our system. So that's one point. And I gave you a second. We have a much more powerful military than ever before, a massive military, industrial, surveillance, and carceral complex of a sort that, George Washington, he couldn't even envision. His army is 5,000 folks who were basically enough to kill a few Indians and mop up the continent, but not enough to threaten Americans. That's the whole idea. So, and now I'm going to tell you a third thing. It's an almost impossible job. There's so many things you have to do. You have to be military commander-in-chief and diplomat-in-chief and spy master-in-chief and legislator-in-chief through the veto, and you have to be party leader now because it's a two-party system, and post-Woodrow Wilson, you have to be leader of the free world, and you have to manage federal properties and be prosecutor and pardoner-in-chief and manager-in-chief of a huge bureaucracy, a hirer and firer-in-chief. And some people may have some experience firing people, as in The Apprentice or something. But it's really hard to have all of these competences. Really hard. And there's no great training for this, truthfully. You can be vice president, but that's different. You can be first spouse, but that's different. You can be a governor, but you don't understand foreign affairs. You can be a senator, but that's not an executive post. You can be a military leader, but you may not understand civilian authority. You have to be good at so many different things. And there's no great training for it. And the American people put such ridiculously high expectations on you to solve everything. And you can't actually, without a House and a Senate, and even if you have them, the Supreme Court can smack down your EPA plan or whatever, because that's ghosts of administrations past. It's a really hard job. And most presidents have been failed presidents, okay? And we don't think about that, but that actually is true. And the only question is whether they are small fails or epic fails. There haven't been that many hugely successful presidents. I talk in the end of the book about the presidents who win again, and who hand off power to their successors. Those are the most successful presidents. That's Washington, that's Jefferson, that's Andrew Jackson. Abraham Lincoln, if we skip over Andrew Johnson and go to Ulysses S. Grant. Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan. Those are the folks who actually win again, hand off power in effect to their wingmen, and then their party is sort of the dominant party over the next period until the tide turns again. To repeat, Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, FDR, and Reagan. And I'm trying not to be partisan here. I'm just a political scientist sort of analyzing the thing. It's a really impossible job. Not very many people have done it well. So yeah, we have to ask ourselves, should we revise it in certain ways? How do we think about the cabinet or the vice presidency or other checks and balances? You're right. Those are the questions we should ask because Washington is astonishing. He's like a once, in a generation world historical figure. Without him, I'm not sure we would have had the Constitution. We definitely, I'm not sure we would have had America. He's not just the father of his country, he's the father of the Constitution, the project, and he's pre-party and above party. Okay, now we have how can you be the leader of us all and the leader of the government and one political party to do both at the same time? Now, it's hard. I think Ronald Reagan managed it pretty well. There were two presidents after Washington who were at least like presidents above party. They are Ulysses S. Grant, 2 terms, and Dwight Eisenhower. And in our lifetime, that might have been someone like Colin Powell, who could have actually, won under either. But you have to lead half the country because you have to be head of party and lead us all. You have to be Queen Elizabeth and Boris Johnson. I mean, just think about that at once. That's quite an image, sort of head of government and head of party, but also head of state, head of the world, head of the Commonwealth. Wow. So you're asking the right question. Yes.
Good afternoon, Earl Watts, Waterville, Maine. I'm glad you brought up the Supreme Court because that's my question. First of all, I do want to say thank you for your collaboration with Peter Segal.
Peter Segal.
I've used those in my classroom.
He's such a cool guy. Big shout out to you, Peter. Thank you for all your friendship over the years.
So it appears with recent rulings that the originalist viewpoint is coming back very strongly in the Supreme Court. Going back to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2 says that the people are the ones who will elect representatives. States decided who the people were. All the states, except for New Jersey, basically decided that the people were white males. It's never been changed in the Constitution. We have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, which extend rights, but they don't rewrite the definition of the people. We have the 19th Amendment, which extends voting to women. We have the 26th Amendment, which extends voting to 18-year-olds, but that's it. Do we have to have, according to an originalist view, amendments to extend to be safe and secure in your surroundings, to own a weapon, according to the Second Amendment? Because it's for the people. And that hasn't been updated in 240 years.
Brilliant set of questions, truly brilliant about originalism, the limitations of the democratic project. How do we think about this today? I told you that the Constitution was the most democratic deed in the history of planet Earth up to that point. But of course, from today's perspective, it's outrageous because women in general didn't vote, and there were property qualifications in many places, and and blacks in some places couldn't vote, and there was slavery, of course. Okay, so I'm judging 1787 by 1786 or 1686 or 1586, and I'm saying it's actually pretty good. You say, yeah, but there's also slavery, but slavery exists in all the world. It doesn't begin in 1619. And in fact, the thing that Americans do basically originate is not slavery, but actually the idea of abolition, not freeing slaves. That's in the Old Testament at Ben-Hur. That's in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, if your taste inclines for the community. Individual slaves being freed, yes. But the ancient world never had an idea of ending slavery everywhere as a system. The world's first abolitionist society is formed in Philadelphia in 1775. And eventually Ben Franklin and Benjamin Ross, who signed the Declaration of Independence, will be its leader. So, and it takes us too long to do it, but I'm judging 1787 by what happened before. Now, I'm an originalist. You might say, oh, I heard you were a Democrat. I am. You clicked for C. Breyer. I did. Democrats can be originalists. It's not a uniquely conservative idea. It's about taking the Constitution's history seriously. And the most important originalist ever on the Supreme Court was actually a liberal, a crusader, Franklin Roosevelt's first appointee to the court, Hugo Black. He was a weird guy. He always carried a copy of the Constitution around with him. What kind of weird fellow would do that? So But he's a great liberal. And one of the differences between liberal originalists and conservative originalists, and I'm so glad you asked this question. I have an essay, it just got uploaded yesterday on Time magazine's website, time.com, is about originalism. Some of our greatest statespersons and jurists have been originalists. Abraham Lincoln is an originalist. And John Marshall is an originalist. So am I, so is Hugo Black, and I write about it. But the liberal originalists tend to be better at talking not just about the founding, but the amendments. We, the people, have made amends over time for some of the sins of and the omissions of the founding fathers. I told you it was pro-democracy, but also pro-slavery. And at the end of the day, a famous person says that he doesn't think actually America can exist half slave and half free. It's going to have to be all of one or all the other. Thank God it's all of the other half. It's now all free. If you're an originalist of the right sort, I studied under Robert Bork. I knew Antonin Scalia well. I'm a friend of Clarence Thomas's and Samuel Alito's. They're conservative originalists. I'm a liberal originalist. What's the difference? Well, in part, liberal originalists tend to pay more attention to the amendments that involved more women, more persons of color than at the founding moment. And actually, 5 different amendments talk about the right to vote. They didn't say it at the founding because of race and slavery. 14th Amendment, Section 2, 15th Amendment, which was mentioned, 19th Amendment, which was mentioned, women's suffrage, the 24th Amendment, and the 26th Amendment. So no poll taxes and young adults. Originalism at its best is about thinking about not just the founding, but the later generations, which, and the amendments, they've actually almost all made the project more free and equal, more participatory. And that project hasn't ended. We need a 28th Amendment and a 29th, but we have to come together as a people to do that. Both parties are going to need to be involved because it needs 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the states. We're going to be more likely to do that if we actually have a common narrative, if we actually know where we came from and what the vector is, the path. So I just told you something pretty interesting. It's hard to amend the Constitution, although they added 10 from right out of the gate, which you call the Bill of Rights. It was originally 12, but 2 initially didn't get ratified. 1 got ratified later. So other generations have added amendments, and we could too if we could cohere. But I told you something interesting. The amendments have almost always made the project better, more free, more equal. We can talk about prohibition, which made me a mistake, but it was repealed. But all the other, they added to liberty and equality. The right to vote again and again and again and again for blacks, for women, for people who can't pay a poll tax, for 18, 19, 20-year-olds. And we're not done. So I wrote a book called America's Unwritten Constitution, and the last chapter was about what the amendments of the future might look like and what they should look like. And I make predictions and prescriptions. So here's what I say. First, the amendments of the future, because if you study the past, we can actually come together more. The amendments of the past, like the Constitution of the past, built on state prototypes. So look at what states are doing. That's going to be a model for what the federal Constitution should look like in the future. States had written constitutions first in 1776. They put the Constitution to a vote in Massachusetts in 1780. Bicameral tripartite, they did that first. They had bills of rights first, which is why the absence looked weird. They got rid of slavery, many of them, first. They gave women the vote, many of them, first. This is a Brandeis point about states as laboratories. So look at what states are doing, point 1. Point 2, I told you it's a 2-party system. You're going to need to get both parties on board as a practical matter. Point 3, the amendments of the past have generally been expanding liberty and equality and not contracting it. You take those 3 simple principles, and I can tell you what will be and what should be the amendments of the future, at least some of them. Okay, ERA, good idea. In most state constitutions, or many state constitutions, I would hope every member of my party, I'm a Democrat, would be in favor of it. I would hope at least half of the members of the other party would be in favor of it. And if they're not, let's have an election on that. States do it. It adds to liberty and equality. I think both parties, could be involved for it. Gandhi was once asked what he thought about Western civilization. And he paused for a moment. He said, I think it would be a good idea. Okay. ERA, I think it would be a good idea. We pick governors by direct election, but not presidents. Direct election is one person, one vote. It's equal. Maybe. I testified on behalf of the constitutional amendment to say, if you're not lucky enough, as I was, to be born in America, or born an American citizen, at some point you should, if you come here legally and you work hard and you make contributions, you should be eligible to be president, just like you're eligible to be governor. Arnold Schwarzenegger, or Jennifer Granholm, or Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, or Madeleine Albright. I'm picking men and women, Democrats and Republicans. States make you eligible to be governor. Why shouldn't you do that for president? States are doing things first. So I testified on behalf of a constitutional amendment for that proposition. It was introduced by a Republican senator, a great Republican senator. He's since passed away. He was the longest serving Republican senator in the history of the Republic, and that was his version of the DREAM Act. Maybe not as exuberant as Obama's or Biden's, but that was his version, and it built on what states were doing for governors. And he was a Republican trying to reach across the aisle to Democrats, and it added to equality. Why is it really fair if you just weren't lucky enough to be born a citizen that you're forever ineligible? His name is Orrin Hatch, and I salute him today. And I testified on behalf of that. I'm a Democrat, he's a Republican, but I'm giving you examples of how, if we know our narrative, it actually helps us understand where we are, where we came from, what that vector looks like, and maybe then where we should and could be going. And we can study how people in the past actually did these epic things, adding the rights to vote, the words 5 times in the Constitution. 14th Amendment, Section 2, 15.1, 19.1, 24th Amendment, 26th Amendment.
Good afternoon, Professor. Thank you for being here. My name is Katie Boland. I'm from Trumbull High School.
We're running out of time, so let's answer these 3 questions.
3 questions, and I'll be short. I'll stop filibustering.
Better not cut me
we
off.
could talk about filibuster reform if you ask.
So again, I'm the fellow from Connecticut. My question for you goes back to the founders. Besides the HBO series on John Adams, why do you think he doesn't get as much credit for the founding of our country as the other 5 you mentioned?
Oh, the person who would, ask that question especially would be John Adams. And in this book, I actually begin with John Adams in Boston, because he says it started in Boston before there was Patrick Henry, before there was Thomas Jefferson, before people were talking about Ben Franklin and George Washington. I was in the room, and at first I said, he writes this 50 years later, then and there, the child independence was born. And I'm saying, you're just sort of imagining all of that. That's what I originally thought. I did more research, and I said, actually, it did start in Boston. Massachusetts was there before Virginia. And Jefferson ends up stealing all the credit for this. And so I understand, your kind of anger. So why doesn't he get he's not on a par with Washington or Franklin, or I would say the others. I think he's distinctly 6th out of 6. That's my ranking. Why? Here's one easy point. He is thrown out on his ass, if I can say that in C-SPAN. I just did, by the American people. George Washington is unanimously elected and unanimously reelected. Thomas Jefferson is reelected and then leaves on his own terms. James Madison, the same. So when the American people throw you out, Donald Trump, it's hard to be on Mount Rushmore, you see. And I told you who the great presidents were, and he knows that, and I told you who the great presidents were, and they were Washington, the greatest, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, FDR, Reagan. I did not mention Teddy Roosevelt quite, although he is literally on Mount Rushmore. So first point, it's not just my judgment, the American people threw him out. And why? Because he made it a crime to criticize the President of the United States. Okay, you can't do that. This Constitution is based on discourse, freedom, opposition, listening to people rather than shutting them down. So that's why he's too cranky. Now, that said, I say a lot of nice things about him, and here's some amazing things about him. I would say the most amazing, he's a patriot, he gives everything. He doesn't age well, he becomes cranky. But the best thing in one word about John Adams, Abigail. Oh, she's just amazing. And I tell you about her, and I tell you about the Remember the Ladies letter, which means something different than what many of you may have thought. Unfortunately, and the biggest kind of constitutional issue of his life, whether to sign the Sedition Act, he listens to Abigail, who is too loyal to him. Sometimes it's possible for a president to actually make a mistake, just surrounding himself with yes people, okay? And Washington is really good listening to people who disagree. He's got Jefferson on his left and Hamilton on his right in his first cabinet. His war councils, people are disagreeing. Adams isn't good at that. He's not a great listener until he drives people away. He listens to Abigail, but she's too loyal to him, and she's annoyed that all these Twitter mobs are attacking John Adams. You know? And she's too thin-skinned, and he is too. So that's why he's not up there with the others.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
Hi, I'm Sarah Witkowski from Florida. And so we've discussed a lot about the Bill of Rights and, discourse. So both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists recognize that the Articles of Confederation were not working. The Federalist Papers had this sense of urgency, while the Anti-Federalist Papers seemed to want to kind of pump the brakes and allude that we had maybe 6 to 9 months before we needed to send this proposal out for ratification, or maybe even send it back to the drawing board. So what do you think? Were the Anti-Federalists correct in this urgency, or do you think that there may have been more time for deliberation?
I'm with the Federalists in thinking that it was a critical moment. There wasn't, you never know when the next crisis could happen. You think it's all about peace and security, and then the World Trade Center falls. So, who saw Putin in Ukraine coming? George Washington is a military person. He understands that he won the American Revolution by this, militarily by this much. He lost almost every day. He had like 3 good days in the whole war, okay? And at Yorktown, there were twice as many French as American fighting persons at land and sea. And he understands he can't count on the French going forward. Words to live by. Do not count on the French. Never count on the French, okay? And Washington understands that they can't count on us either. Nations pursue their own interests, okay? We have to protect ourselves. We don't know when and where the next challenge will be. Could be from Britain, could be from France, could be from Spain. Now is the time to do it. And if we wait, maybe we're dead. And by the way, we haven't paid off all our past debts. So who's going to lend us more for the next one? I'm with Washington in sensing the urgency of the moment.
Thank you.
Richard Sturgeon from Alabama. You've spoken about originalism and secession. One of the challenges to originalism is that even at the beginnings, not everyone had the same original understanding. But you've spoken about how on secession, there actually was agreement on this between those who were pro and anti-ratification. With conservative originalism, quite the rage in many quarters right now, and particularly, say, the Texas GOP, I wonder if you would comment on this alignment of adamantly pushing originalism and yet actually pushing secession, with the Texas GOP actually pushing for a vote on that.
Yes, and it saddens me that the Texas GOP is doing this. This is the party of Lincoln. And it's become the party of Jefferson Davis and secessionism and disunion and treason. And that saddens me. How did we get to this point? I'll give you 2 or 3 thoughts, and I know we're at the end. So one is people don't know their history. You see, and that's why I'm so adamant in the book, and this is why you are doing God's work, because actually, I told you in one sentence, find me one person in this 26 volumes, pro or con, who actually says, hey, money back guarantee. If you don't like it, you can leave. One person, they don't, okay? So they've just gotten their facts wrong, and this is easier to check now than ever before because of word searches and the internet. And the Documentary History of the Ratification Project is online and free. So one is just, there's widespread ignorance and refusal to accept facts about all sorts of things, whether the earth is round or flat, or whether the election was fraudulent or not. So that's one problem. Now that sounds like just what a pointy-headed liberal from the Northeast would say. So now let me say it a different way. One problem is that Texas feels, and not ridiculously so, that there are all sorts of imposition of certain Yankee values on Texas, and there should be more diversity on, for example, reproduction. And one thing that just happened, the Supreme Court is allowing different states to go their own ways. California to go way left, Texas to go way right. Maybe on some things, actually, there's not enough of a national consensus. And when the media on the left just keeps telling you about the polls and the huge national majorities, that's insensitive to regional variation. And the people of Texas understand this most of all, because Texas was its own Lone Star Republic. It was actually, in a way that North Carolina and Rhode Island, not so much. So, and they understand that on some things, maybe we need to actually allow to let Texas be Texas. I'm very pro-choice, but I get it, because I think we have to hold together as Americans, because Putin is a dangerous person and he would love American secession. We have to hold together militarily, geostrategically, and this may mean we have to be a little gentler with each other and allow actually different states to, at least on some things, not on everything, not on things that are clearly in the Constitution, like racial equality and religious equality and gender equality and I would say sexual orientation equality. I think those are all clearly in the Constitution. Other things that aren't so clearly, we liberals may actually need to be more understanding, because that's where we're getting this. That's why we're getting it. And I'll finally end with a personal story, because it's such an honor to be with you. I'm an immigrant. I'm a child of immigrants. I'm born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And so the Constitution on the day of my birth makes me a citizen. It's a great gift, and I've been trying to repay that birthday present ever since by singing the song of the Constitution. But I'm amazingly proud to be an American. And I see how the rest of the world doesn't have what we have. My parents actually fled their part of the world to come here. But we Americans, when we've acted together, have done epic things. When I'm a 9-year-old kid, we put someone on the moon. We did it together, north and south, east and west, red and blue. And we can't do it without Texas, because it turns out to be very helpful to be able, if you're trying to get stuff into space, to do it from a lower latitude. And we need Yankee engineering, but also, Texas strength. We need both. The first word spoken on the lunar surface is Houston. Houston, Tranquility Base, here, the Eagle has landed. Okay, and that's what we can do together when we work together, when we understand the American story together and recognize it's a federal system and there may need to be some variation on some things. Secession, no, but allowing different states, you can drive 70 in Wyoming, but please not in Manhattan. Okay, they're okay. So here's the personal story, because this meant so much to me as an immigrant's kid. It took us a long time to have kids ourselves. And when we finally did, it's 5 a.m. I'm about to tear up. I'm in New Haven. And I call my dad up, because he's a very proud American, as is my mom. I call my dad up. It's 2 o'clock in California, 2 a.m. in California. It's 5 a.m. in New Haven. And I say, Dad, the Eagle has landed. And he knows what I mean. So I'm a deep American patriot. I'm an originalist. We need to know our history. It's what brings us together, whether we're immigrants or the children of immigrants or the great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren of immigrants, some of whom came here with bullwhips and some of whom came here in chains. We need to have an American story. We need to get our facts right. And our facts are, you can't secede. That's not permissible unilaterally. But there are lots of things that you can do. But it begins by knowing the American story. And that's what you are doing every day, is teaching that American story. And so I end where I begin, by thanking you for your service.